Hello, this is A Tale for Halloween. Bill, since his retirement, had entered the town's vegetable show every single year, and for the first 4 years he hadn't won anything, and then he'd migrated to third prizes, and then in the subsequent years to second prizes, and had achieved his first winning rosette for first prize 3 years ago, with a truly impressive pumpkin. And every year since then he had won the same prize with a child of the previous pumpkin grown from the seeds of that pumpkin. Year upon year upon year it had grown bigger and bigger, each pumpkin more impressive than the preceding year's pumpkin. And this year's one was a giant. It was a colossal creature, depending upon the pumpkin plant on his allotment patch. Every day he would go there, rain or shine, sit there for hour upon hour upon hour, tending it lovingly, wrapping the pumpkin in blankets, feeding the roots of the plant with all manner of organically prepared composts made from ingredients so secret that I dare not mention them. And he had watched his pumpkin get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then, a month earlier, had come the terrible news that one of the other sheds upon the allotment had been broken into and trashed, and half of the canes of raspberries and fruit and veg that were grown upon the allotment had been trampled and crushed underfoot, with the footprints of half a dozen different boots. The allotmenteers were up in arms, fearing that this was drug addicts or teenage vandals or hoodlums or possibly rival competitors in the forthcoming fruit and vegetable show. Whoever it was, fear was rife upon the allotment, and people had taken to staying later and later, up until they were all turfed out by the allotment's keeper, who locked the gates at the end of the evening and made them all go home whether they wanted to or not. And then, in the middle of the night, a second shed had been broken into and robbed, and the produce vandalised and destroyed. And Bill's heart was in his throat every single evening when the keeper of the allotment grounds made him, along with all of the other gardeners, go home and leave their prize produce to the tender mercies of whichever dangerous psychopaths were running amok upon the allotments at night. Except on this one night, Bill had turned off the radio early, had turned off the lights in the shed early, even as it grew dark outside, so that no one would realise he was still in the shed, because he fully intended to sleep there. With only 1 week left until the great show, he would sleep there, watching and preserving and looking after his beloved pumpkin. The gates were locked. The allotment keeper went home. All of the other gardeners had gone home. Bill alone sat in silence in his shed. And when he dared to creep out and saw the rest of the allotment grounds in darkness, then he turned on the dimmest of night lights, plugged in his radio, put in his earphones, and prepared to spend a cold and restless but necessary night in his shed, keeping an eye on the safety of his pumpkin. 1 hour passed, 2 hours passed, 3 hours passed, and Bill was very near to the point of nodding off entirely when he heard a giggle, and then a snigger, and then whispered voices muttering something he couldn't quite work out. And then there was the sound of glass breaking somewhere. Bill knew that whoever it was who had been destroying the other sheds, destroying the other allotments with their produce, was here and now. That his pumpkin was at risk. His heart hammering in his chest, he creaked open the shed door. He watched in the darkness, turning down the dim light that illuminated his own shed so that no one would know he was there. And he heard the laughter and the giggle and the snorting of the voices of young men getting closer and closer, and the snap of garden canes being broken, the shattering of clay pots, closer and closer. Bill, in the moonlight, looked around his shed and thought suddenly to himself, what was he going to do if 2, 3, 4 young men turned up, probably drunk, probably high, perhaps off their head on glue or coke or who the hell knew what? What would he do? Shout at them? Scare them off? Wave his walking stick at them? Would that be enough? Would they not just set about him as violently and as brutally as they had set around the plants and the produce and all of those other allotments on the sheds themselves? No, he needed something more than just waving his walking stick at them. He looked around his shed and he saw the old shovel. He snatched it up. He waited and waited, breath clouding upon the cold air as the sounds of the approaching hoodlums got closer and closer and closer. And suddenly he heard the breaking of pots just feet from the door of his shed. And plucking up all of his courage in his hands, he burst out of the shed, roaring and shouting and swinging the spade hither and yon, until something went snap. And he felt the spade thud into something all too human. There was a scream and a gurgle, shouts and hollers as people ran hither and yon in all directions, the sound of breaking canes here, the sound of breaking pots there, until at last the voices receded into the distance. And finally the hammering of his heart, after nearly half an hour of standing there shaking and shivering, began to subside. And he realised in the moonlight there was something or someone laying on the ground outside of his shed. Shaking like a leaf, he went back into the shed, found his torch, clicked it on, and played it upon his pumpkin. And Gods be praised, the pumpkin was untouched, unmarred, undamaged. And then he sought out that dark, shadowy figure, ill-lit by moonlight. It was a young man. Training the torchlight upon the young man's face, he saw the blood trickling from the head wound, a bad head wound, a severe head wound. The lad looked maybe 18 or 19, spotty, ill-kempt, probably clearly up to no good. And then the young man groaned. He wasn't dead. And Bill thought, I should call the police, I should call an ambulance. And he went inside his shed to find his battered old mobile phone and stopped. He had heard numerous stories of people whose houses had been burgled, where they'd turned round and shot the burglar or stabbed the burglar and then themselves been sent to prison for doing what any decent Englishman should do of protecting his own property. And here was he, illegally late on the allotment ground after the keeper had shut the gate and gone off, when he shouldn't be there. Admittedly, these young thugs shouldn't be there either, but neither should he. If people were sent to prison for defending their own homes, what would he be sent down for? How many years inside would he get for defending a shed and a pumpkin? Would a judge, would a jury appreciate the importance of that pumpkin, appreciate that this was his sovereign soil, the labours of months and months of hard work? Or would they just see an assault upon some revolting youth who would probably get social workers pleading his case about how hard done by he had been and how wicked his parents were to him, and one pathetic excuse after another? He'd read the Daily Mail, he knew how this went. And if he was inside, who would look after the pumpkin? Who would put that pumpkin into the show? Who would win that first prize? Not him. Not him. And it came to him there and then what he should do. He took up the shovel and he brought it down upon that young man's head again and again and again until he was positive the young man was no more. And he sat there for the best part of an hour, wheezing and gasping from his exertions, working up the energy to take the next step. For he couldn't take that young man's body anywhere. He was an old man. He hadn't the strength to cart a young body around, a heavy young man, almost 6 foot tall from the look of him. But he could do what any good gardener, what any experienced gardener could do. He dug and dug and dug a long trench, and he stripped the body naked, removed all identifying remarks, any metal that someone with a metal detector might notice, not that anyone with a metal detector ever came onto the grounds of the allotment, but all sorts of ideas were flooding through old Bill's head. He buried that young man deep in the allotment, only a foot or two from the great pumpkin itself, where all of the ground was covered in straw, so that he could cover up the signs of burial with straw once again, and none of the other gardeners would remark or notice any difference. There would be no odd-shaped patches of turned soil that might be demanded of an explanation. It was nearly 5 a.m. by the time he'd finished. Well, by the time he didn't have the energy to go home, not that he even could climb over the great mesh gates that had been locked by the groundskeeper. So he returned to the shed and waited there for the morning until the groundskeeper came and opened up, and the early allotmenteers came to tend their patches, and he came out, did a few things to look unsuspicious, and then staggered home feeling like death warmed over to face his wife Elsie, who knew perfectly well that he was intending to spend the night on the allotment, and she frankly was glad to see the back of him to spend a night on the allotment if they had not been happily married for many a long year. But negligent though she was, she would notice him coming home shaking, shivering, looking the worse for wear. Would she believe that he was simply cold from a night sleeping in the shed? Or would she see through his pretences and realise that something far more serious had happened? He took the chance. By the time he got home, she was only just waking up, bleary-eyed, staggering around the kitchen, mumbling and grumbling to herself. He grunted at her, she grunted at him. He went upstairs, showered, scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed for any patches of blood, any splatters, any telltale signs or marks. He washed them off with intensity, far cleaner that day than he had been for many a long year, and went to bed, tossing and turning all day long, expecting a knock at the door from the local constabulary, keeping the radio on, expecting to hear announcements of mysterious body discovered on allotment. But nothing. Until, still tired, still exhausted, he came down for his evening meal. His wife, Elsie, well, she grunted at him over the meal, he grunted at her. They seldom had conversations these days, but even she remarked how rough he was looking. Was he intending to go up to the allotment as usual to look at that damned pumpkin? Because she thought he looked as if he could do with an early night. Clearly he was getting far too old for all these nonsensical shenanigans, or of sleeping in sheds just to look after a bloody vegetable. Well, he mumbled and muttered incoherently, and she never paid much attention to his answers anyway, but he said he would go just for half an hour just to check on the pumpkin, and then he would be back for an early night. And she acknowledged it with her usual grunt. Off he went, tremulous, to the allotment, getting there half an hour before the gates would be shut, shuffling through, passing a few words here and there with the other allotmenteers. No one mentioned anything about break-ins. There was a little bit of muttering about broken pots here and there and broken canes, but nothing to raise suspicions. No sign of the police, no yellow tape cordoning off his shed. It looked exactly as he had left it. Well, the shed looked exactly as he had left it. The amassed, rotting, decomposing straw upon the turned earth looked exactly as he had left it. But the pumpkin looked as if it were a good 5 or 6 inches wider in diameter than it had been that very morning. It looked deeper and more vividly orange than he had seen it in many a long week. It looked beautiful, it looked well nourished. And as he stood there, hearing the sound of the groundskeeper calling for them all to leave, his mind racing, he thought, Of all of the composts he had tried, nurturing not only this year's prize specimen but the previous year's prize specimen, the one thing he had never tried was blood and bone. And maybe that is what the pumpkin needed. And he thought about this, and he thought about this. All the way home he thought about this, for he felt safe leaving the pumpkin that night, because those young thugs that he had scared off, he couldn't imagine them coming back, especially when one of their friends was missing. They'd be off doing other things. They wouldn't revisit the allotment, he felt sure. And all that night, as he was drifting deeper and deeper into sleep, he was dreaming of blood and bone, of bone and blood, and of the wonderful, glowing, healthy state of that pumpkin. The days rolled past, and each day he went to the allotment, the pumpkin seemed bigger than the day before. And then, by the Thursday, it seemed to stabilise. The show wasn't until Sunday. And he reasoned to himself that the reason for this pumpkin stabilising was perhaps that the body had decayed as much as it was going to in the short term. The nutrients had been released into the soil. The roots of the pumpkin had drawn up as much blood, as much bone as they were likely to from that one body. Maybe there was a need for a little more. And when he got home that night, he went onto his laptop and he searched on all of his various gardening sites for local garden centres that sold blood and bone meal to put into the soil. And they all did. And some of them were made from sheep bone and sheep blood, and some from cow bone and cow blood, and some from pig bone and pig blood. And he thought to himself, which one would be most like human? And Elsie was stomping and clonking around the kitchen, making as much noise as she usually made. He had never met a woman who could make as much noise just making a cup of coffee as she did, muttering and grumbling and mumbling to herself as she had done for decade after decade after decade of miserable, lonely, loveless marriage. And he thought to himself, pig blood, cow bone, ground up sheep, they were all well and good. But could you trust to them as much as the tried method, the tested method? It would be difficult to find some other young hooligan. What pretense could he use to lure them up to the allotment? There were ladies of the night, but would they go to a shed on an allotment? And there was Elsie, still moaning, still muttering, still clanging and banging the kettle and the cups and slamming the fridge door, and he thought, would anyone miss her? Her sister was dead. Her mother was dead. They'd never had any children. She seldom went out of the house except to shop. What few friends she had, well, he could say she'd gone off to visit some relative. They didn't know what relatives she had and what relatives she didn't have. And it would be nice to come home to a quiet house, to come home to a house without nagging, without moaning, without complaining. And the more he thought of it, the more sense it made. And he looked at his watch and realised he had an hour to get up to the allotment. And he said to her, Elsie, don't cook tonight. Let's go out. We'll go out for a meal. We'll go out to a restaurant. I feel sure I'm going to win the best in show once again for the pumpkin, and I want to celebrate. I want to rejoice with. We haven't been out in, well, the best part of 20 odd years. Why don't we go out? And she looked at him as if he had suddenly started speaking Martian, but with a little bit of convincing, he managed to persuade. He said, we'll dress up, we'll go somewhere nice, but before we go, let's you and I go up to the allotment, we'll drink a toast to the pumpkin. And she said, I don't want to go to your bloody allotment. I'm not drinking a toast to a flaming vegetable. But, he said, Let's just do it. I'll make you happy by taking you out for a meal. You make me happy by coming and drinking a toast to my pumpkin, and then we'll go off to the swankiest restaurant in town." And with a little bit more persuading and his eye always upon the kitchen clock that they had to get there before the gates were locked, he finally persuaded her, and off they went. Well, it was late and it was dark by the time they got to the allotment. People were beginning to pack their bits up. He knew that it would be about 10 or so minutes before the gatekeeper turfed everyone out and locked the great mesh gates to the allotment. And he took his wife inside and said, "I've got a bottle of whiskey." "Ah, I know it, I knew it," she said. "I've often thought you were drinking up at the allotment." "Don't worry, we'll just have a quick tot each, drink the health of the pumpkin, then we'll go home, put on our best glad rags, and we'll hit the town." He poured a tot each. He knocked his back, she knocked hers back, and before she'd even put the shot glass back upon the bench in the shed, he rammed home the knife, clamping a hand around her mouth as she sank to the floor, bleeding, but he made sure to leave the knife in the wound because he'd heard about how bodies would bleed out if the knife were removed, and he wanted the blood to go into the pumpkin and not be wasted upon the floor of the shed. He shut the door of the shed, himself inside, his wife, her life dissipating on the floor inside. And they waited in silence until he was sure the last person had gone. The gatekeeper had made his rounds to check there were no lights on in sheds, no stragglers with wheelbarrows or buckets. And when he was absolutely sure that the gatekeeper had locked up and gone home and it was just himself with the remains of Elsie, he set about digging another trench on the other side of the pumpkin. He stripped Elsie, the first time he'd bothered doing so in about 30 odd years, and shovelled her into the ground, removing the knife at the last minute to ensure the blood would seep out and seep out and seep out, feeding the roots of his beloved pumpkin. And then he went and slept a peaceful night in the shed. And in the morning he milled amongst the early gardeners for half an hour before racing home to wash off any telltale signs of blood and have a decent day's sleep before returning in the evening and noticing how much better the pumpkin looked. It had grown a good 9 or 10 inches just in that one day alone. Its diameter increased and increased and increased. It was radiant in colour. It was beautiful. It was throbbing with life, as well it might be. And the next day it was better still. And even on the morning of the great vegetable show itself, on that Sunday morning, it seemed to grow and grow before his very eyes as he began to clip the connection to the wider plant, to cut the feeding roots into the pumpkin. And with the aid of 4 big lads who had paid a £5 or 2 each, they got that enormous pumpkin that felt it weighed almost as much as Elsie herself weighed, and Lord knows she weighed enough, but they got the pumpkin into the wheelbarrow, and the whole lot of them wheeled the pumpkin to the showground. Bill at the handles of the barrow and the other lads holding it steady, making sure it didn't tip, making sure not an ounce of damage came to that glorious pumpkin. Into the mighty marquee with all of the leeks and the marrows and the carrots and the mounds of Brussels sprouts and vegetable after vegetable and the apples and the pears and the blackberries laid out in the fruit section. All of the other gardeners nodding and waving and smiling hello to each other. They came to the table allotted to Bill, and they heaved that gargantuan pumpkin out and placed it upon the artificial green turf acquired from a greengrocer laid out upon the table. They put the little name card in front of the pumpkin, and Bill himself, having paid off his helper, sat behind that pumpkin, a smile upon his face so wide it nearly split in two, and no one remarked that Elsie wasn't there to join him and watch, because she never came. And he thought of all the stories he could tell to the neighbours to explain her absence. They'd believe anything. Most of them hardly spoke English anyway, let alone much cared about where Elsie may or may not have been. And he watched as the judges came into the tent an hour later. He watched them going from table to table to table, writing down comments on their clipboard at the leeks and the potatoes and the cabbages and the carrots, getting closer and closer, and he saw them stop by old Jack's stand, his hated rival, the one who had almost won on several occasions, almost whipped the gold certificate away from him. He saw the massive pumpkin on old Jack's stand that looked almost, but not quite, just almost as big as his own pumpkin. And he felt sure his was just that little bit bigger. And he waited for them to come, a fixed grin upon his face, giving his all to the pumpkin, feeding, concentrating, putting his life and his soul into that pumpkin, that they should look upon it and see it as the glorious thing that it was. And the three judges stood before the table that groaned under the weight of the pumpkin, and they oohed and they ahed and they wrote down comments and they touched the pumpkin and they smelt the pumpkin and they looked at it from different angles, and they consulted amongst each other and said, without any doubt, when it came to giant vegetables, this was truly the most humongous pumpkin they had ever seen in their long lives as judges of vegetable shows. Nothing could possibly surpass what Bill had grown. And without any shadow of a doubt, as all of the other gardeners gathered around and cheered and clapped and feigned grins of admiration for their hated rival, the cup and the rosette were presented to Bill, who sat there glassy-eyed with a fixed smile upon his face, still and silent. And the judge, the old vicar, held out the rosette, expecting Bill to take it, but Bill just sat there. And the judge coughed and said, "Sir, your rosette, would you like to take this, to place it upon your pumpkin, when you stand beside the pumpkin and the photographer will take your picture?" And Bill just sat there staring, unmoving, unspeaking. The vicar began to wonder if he'd had a fit from the excitement. He reached out a hand and shook old Bill's shoulders, and Bill gradually slid stiffly, coldly to the floor. There were gasps, there was shock. People rushed in to see, and a woman screamed. For as they leaned over the table, they could see that Bill hadn't simply had a heart attack. They could see the green tendrils from the pumpkin growing down and down and down in to Bill's stomach, feeding off him, drawing off him. And as they watched, that pumpkin seemed to get bigger and deeper in its orange hues, just as Bill grew thinner and paler and more deflated, and gave his life and his all to the great pumpkin that won the show. Thank you.